Hello, my name's Nigel Thorne, and I'm concerned that senior figures within the Welsh Government have been unduly influenced by misplaced empathy to champion a dangerous ideology. During a virtual Senate meeting in May 2022, Education Minister Jeremy Miles stated,
"This is an area which is really very important to me personally because I'm having grown up as a gay young person, I have just a first-hand experience of what it's like to be at the receiving end of homophobia. So I think this is a very key priority for me as Education Minister. And I think it's quite shocking to think that young LGBTQ plus kids in school today are still receiving bullying and sexual harassment on that basis. So in terms of the work we are doing on the trans guidance specifically, over the course of the rest of this year, we're taking forward the development of a whole school approach to RSE, and clearly LGBTQ plus inclusion will feature significantly in that, and it includes specific guidance to schools to support trans children and young people. It's clear, just the way that Sugar Williams, your question was suggesting, schools are keen to have clear and robust guidance and training as well, actually, to support trans children and young people.
Leo Sapir, a fellow of the Manhattan Institute, recognises two mutually incompatible propositions underpinning gender identity ideology: queer theory and gender identity essentialism. Queer theory, promoted in academia, teaches that gender is performed and a gender identity is created in response to performing that gender. In contrast, gender identity essentialism is the belief that gender identity exists pre-socialization, that it is innate. Now, among many organisations who promote this belief is Stonewall, who tell teachers that children can recognise their gender identity from as young as 2. GIRES, a trans advocacy organisation that was established in 1997, also promotes this belief. The chair of trustees is Cat Burton, a trans-identified male who sits on the Welsh Government Independent LGBTQ plus expert panel. If teachers in Wales enter the word transgender on Hwb, the Welsh Government Resources site, they will be presented a series of lesson plans on understanding gender variance and transgender. Lesson plans 3 and 4 provide links to the GIRES website. On the GIRES website, in a section on support for educators, it states, information, advice and training are provided not only by GIRES, but also by the All Sorts Youth Project, Gendered Intelligence, Mermaids and Schools Out. The All Sorts Youth Project produced a trans inclusion toolkit referenced in the Trans Inclusion Toolkit for Wrexham schools. The Wrexham Toolkit states, given the spectrum of trans identities and experiences, it is important that any support you offer a trans child or young person starts with identifying their individual needs. It is important that their identity is validated and supported in any work that you do. The LGBTQ plus expert panel recommend that the Welsh Government produce national trans guidance as exemplified by the guidance produced by Wrexham. Jay Stewart, the CEO of Gendered Intelligence, was motivated to transition by queer theory and the writings of Judith Butler. Mermaids, along with GIRES, have been accused of having undue influence in the promotion of so-called affirmation therapy at the JIDS clinic at the Tavistock. Schools Out, the organisation responsible for starting LGBT plus History Month in the UK, works in schools and is highly opposed to gender-critical beliefs. Kate Hutchinson, a trans-identified male and trustee of Schools Out UK, sits on the Welsh Government Independent LGBTQ plus expert panel. Stephanie Davis-Arai, founder of Transgender Trend, talks about children with gender dysphoria, GIAs, and its influence in schools.
So I'm going to talk today about that term transgender kids and how we have changed our language in the way that we refer to children who have gender dysphoria. The term transgender by definition establishes gender conformity as the rule. It teaches children that if you transgress the gender rules for your sex, you must go over to the other side and identify yourself as the opposite sex. Even if your gender transgression is not that extreme, you can no longer claim to be a boy or a girl. You must redefine yourself as non-binary, neither boy nor girl or a mixture of both. And it's suggested to children who transgress the gender rules for their sex that the fault in them is so grave that medical intervention is necessary to correct it. If you are a girl who has interests typically or traditionally associated with boys, then you are a boy. This is your true, authentic self, and this can only be expressed through a lifetime as a medical patient. So who would teach children such a regressive, misogynistic, and harmful way of understanding themselves? Well, now schools and the Department for Education and local authorities. So this is no marginalised sector of society lobbying to get their voices heard. This is policy capture at the highest level by organisations and charities such as Stonewall, Mermaids, Gendered Intelligence, GIRAs, All Sorts, and Educate and Celebrate. And these are not child support organisations in any neutral sense, but activists who are at the forefront of shaping public policy and government legislation for the whole of society. They're political organisations. They're heavily funded by government departments and lottery grants and charities such as Children in Need. And between them, they advise and provide training for the police, the Home Office, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the Crown Prosecution Service. They've done Girl Guiding UK, the Football Association, Sports England, the Prison and Probation Service. I could go on. But along with schools, the NHS, the NSPCC, and social services, and of course the media. So the political campaign of transgender activists has two key goals. One is to establish gender identity as the distinction between men and women in society and in law. And the other one is to establish affirmation and social transition as the only legitimate approach towards children with gender dysphoria. And these two campaign goals are inextricably linked, because if you're saying that gender identity is innate, then you have to say children are born with it. And it's no secret that these self-appointed experts who are influencing policies on children, such as GIRAs, and share the political aims of the most extreme activists that we see on Twitter to change the definition of man and woman in law. According to GIRAs, our gender identity is our psychological sense of fitting into social categories. That's my italics there. Typically of man or woman, and that's from their e-learning resource. So GIRAs claims that it is this feeling about our social position which defines us as boys and girls or men or women, and yet also claims that this feeling is determined pre-socially, existing before birth. That's their, really clever, self-aware fetuses we're looking at. So just a quick look at how the transgender resources in schools teach this message to the youngest children from early years onwards. This is the GIRA's teaching resource, which really shows very clearly how this theory of gender identity is based on essentialist brain theories that you either have a pink brain or a blue brain, and those brains can end up in any bodies. Next one. And this is just one of the ways. This is from a book called Introducing Teddy, and this is for early years children, and it shows one of the main messages that children are taught in these books, that I need to be myself. And if you look at all of the transgender books for children, you'll notice that whereas books about gay and lesbian people tend to be older people or two mummies or two daddies, the transgender books are all about children transitioning, or teddies or penguins, creatures without genitals. And this is one of the key messages, that being transgender is being your true, authentic self. And once we call a child transgender, rather than calling a child factually a child with gender dysphoria, then we have to follow that with the approach of affirmation, because otherwise we would be transphobic. So I want to point out that what schools are being asked to do is not to include transgender people like under the protected characteristic Gender Reassignment and Equality Act, and make sure that they are referring to that protected characteristic and ensuring that there is no discrimination against children who identify as transgender, which would be correct. What they are being asked to do is to take part in an experimental approach towards children, which is called affirmation and social transition. And affirmation is not a model which has been informed and developed through clinical research, and there is no evidence to support its use in schools.
Kate Hutchinson tells teachers that Transgender Trend are an anti-trans group. Another member of the LGBTQ plus expert panel who believes in gender identity essentialism is Dr. Sophie Quinney, a highly political medical professional and clinician at Wales's only gender clinic in Cardiff.
Hello, my name is Sophie Quinney and I'm one of the gender clinicians here at the Cardiff Clinic. My professional background is general practice, and I joined the movement to improve healthcare for trans and non-binary people in 2018.
Quinney signed an open letter to the organisers of London Pride, complaining about the actions of Get the L Out, a protest by a handful of lesbian activists in front of the Pride March in London in 2018. The letter from July 2018 was written by Amy Challoner, a trans-identified young man, and at that time member of the Stonewall Trans Advisory Board and a candidate for the deputy leadership of the Green Party, whose campaign manager was his father, David Challoner. By the end of August 2018, David Challoner had been convicted of the rape and torture of a 10-year-old girl. The remarkable story of the meteoric rise and fall of Amy Challoner is told in a YouTube video by a trans woman, Rose of Dawn, the link to which is included below. Dr. Quinney is highly invested in gender-affirming care. As she explains to Kate Hutchinson, patients can be referred without any mental health assessment.
If they're age 17 and a half and over, they can be referred directly now to the Welsh Service by their GP. So that's a huge relief to have that put in place. But certainly for adults, we've managed to get rid of the mental health component, which is great. So that's a positive.
Dr. Quinney has been highly influenced by Ben Vincent, a queer, non-binary academic and a former trustee of GIRES. Vincent is also a contributor to the WPATH Standards of Care version 8. In an article that is a dialogue between Vincent and Quinney, Vincent states, "Beware the idea that a person's physiology, anatomy, or genetics fundamentally are male or female things. Doing so is political, not a foregone conclusion of a morally neutral scientific enterprise." Vincent and Quinney have created training modules on gender diversity and trans health for Health Education and Improvement Wales, which are available for every healthcare professional in Wales. Celebrating the launch, Professor Pushpinder Mangat, Medical Director, HEIW, said, "These are our first training modules for health professionals around the care of trans and non-binary people. We're really grateful to Stonewall Cymru for working in collaboration and supporting HEIW with their development." Regarding gender identity services, Quinney writes, "Referrals to gender identity services in the UK are increasing, including on behalf of young people under the age of 18. For the most part, this is likely to reflect improved access to information and representation." In a training video, she further states,
"Gender identity is an internal sense of oneself as being a boy, man, girl, woman, or something else. While gender roles can be informed by the social world, evidence suggests that gender identity is rooted in neurobiology."
Sophie disagrees.
What explains this dramatic surge in transgender identification among young people? And there are two hypotheses. One is the social acceptance hypothesis that basically says, these kids have always existed. The rates that we're seeing are completely normal. The only thing that's changed is that society has become more tolerant, more accepting, and therefore these kids feel more comfortable coming out and telling everybody who they truly are. So that's the social acceptance hypothesis. But then there's also the social contagion hypothesis, which says that trans identification is primarily or exclusively a fad, a kind of a thing that teenagers influence each other into doing. That there are all these kind of cultural cues and social incentives that get kids, and particularly girls, will get into that, to identify in this way. And that's known as the social contagion hypothesis. Okay, so let's get into some of the evidence for each one of these. So the social acceptance hypothesis, as I said, assumes that trans kids, that first of all, that there is this category of individuals called trans kids, that people are born like this. They're born with a gender identity that doesn't match their sex. Usually this is couched in the analogy to gay rights. Just as gay people are born that way, so too trans people are. Especially in the context of civil rights regulation in the federal courts, advocacy organizations have made claims about brain sex, meaning that gender identity has a neurological foundation. But there really is no good evidence for these claims. The claims on behalf of a neurological basis are based on studies with a very, very small cohort, the most famous of them having examined only 6 adult transsexuals. And even then, it could not control for confounding factors like homosexuality. So there really is a very, very weak basis for the neurological explanation. And so instead, it's inferred psychologically by the consistency or the tenacity of a person's assertions, right? And this also appears in psychological literature. They acknowledge this point that we don't yet know what causes a person to reject their sex. All we can know is we can infer things based on their behavior. And another reason to doubt the kind of the neurological or innate explanation of gender identity is that the vast majority of kids who exhibit these behaviors and who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria historically, 11 studies have shown, will desist, meaning they'll come to terms with their sex by puberty, and the vast majority of them, by the way, will come out as gay or lesbian, whereas in contrast, close to 0% of gay or lesbian people spontaneously become heterosexual, right? So that's kind of more evidence that the whole gender identity being brain sex explanation lacks evidence. I should also note that there's a tension within the social acceptance argument, which is that the same people making that argument often claim that we are living in times of unprecedented hostility towards trans people. And for exactly that reason, we need a robust civil rights program to protect trans people from growing social hostility. So it's not clear how those two arguments can fit together, that more kids are coming out because society is more welcoming, but society has unprecedented levels of hostility, and therefore we need civil rights protections.
In July 2022, it was announced that the GIDS clinic at the Tavistock was to shut as it was not a safe option. Doctors reported concerns that some patients were referred onto a gender transitioning pathway too quickly. In an interview, Hannah Barnes, author of Time to Think, the inside story of the collapse of the Tavistock's gender service for children, said,
I don't think that the majority of people that worked at GIDS were ideologues. They were just hardworking, caring professionals who wanted to help kids, like the vast majority. And that's why, and they became concerned when the reality didn't really match the theory, if you like. Where I think ideology really impacted on GIDS is that there seemed to be this inability to stand up to some of the trans charities and groups. And, you know, it was lobbying in part, not totally, absolutely not, but pressure from those groups that helped lower the age at which puberty blockers could be available in the first place. There was a real big push for that. But there was pressure from elsewhere too, and in the medical community. But I think there was this almost, clinicians have described to me, there was this fear of sort of upsetting those groups like Mermaids, which people have probably heard of, and Gyras, and that when data became available that challenged what they thought they knew, and that perhaps showed that actually puberty blockers weren't working in the way they thought and had been telling families, they didn't change direction. And some clinicians told me that they felt that that was because there was a fear of how some of the groups might respond.
Barnes commented on the huge proportion of children who transitioned who were same-sex attracted.
Every clinician I spoke to said that so many of those young people were same-sex attracted, even those that spoke really favourably about the work at GIDS, and particularly the girls. And actually, when those clinicians who were gay themselves raised those concerns, they say they were accused of being too close to the work, that they were seeing something that wasn't there. And what they've turned around and says, look, they say, look at the data. Like, it's really rubbish. Like, we don't have much of it, but what we do have absolutely bears that out. So GIDS's data for every single young person that was referred to them in 2012, of the ones they have data for, which is the sort of the older ones, they didn't ask the very young kids, what is it? I think 90% of the girls identified as either same-sex attracted or bisexual, and 80% of the boys. And then in slightly more recent stats, those come down to about 70% and 60% respectively, but they're still incredibly high. So they're saying we weren't seeing something that wasn't there. And I've spoken to young people themselves. There's a case in the book, Harriet, who said, I was a lesbian, and it was so obvious. I went into my GIDS assessment, and they talked about the first relationship that I'd had with a girl, and I felt really ashamed about it because she wouldn't talk to me in public. And I've never been attracted to a boy. And all that was ignored. So it's not... the data, the personal experiences, the experiences of the clinicians, it's there. And I have to stress that of the people I spoke to for the book, not all of whom are named or quoted, but collectively, they've worked with thousands of young people directly, sitting in a room like we are now, face to face. It's just, I don't think it's credible to pretend that the overwhelming number of people who might be affected by this are gay, bisexual or lesbian.
Those parents who believe that Welsh Government policies are in danger of transing away Welsh gay school children may wish to support Public Child Protection Wales.